Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to those who are joining us today for our webinar on understanding and using your WGEA reports for 2023-24. I'm Penelope Cottrell, the Executive Manager of Education and Research here at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, or WGEA. As we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today on the call. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and extend my respect to their elders past and present. So to today's agenda, we will begin by setting the scene with some brief background on WGEA's Gender Equality Reporting Program, to then dive into today's topic, the reports themselves. We're going to cover how to understand them, interpret them, and really crucially, how to use them to drive change in your organisation. We'll briefly touch on the compliance requirements for the year ahead and reporting in 2025, and finish with your Q&A. And thank you to those who submitted questions as part of the registration. We've structured today's content to try and touch on as many of those as possible, so we hope that you'll find today really, really useful. Before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping points. Today's session will be recorded and we'll make that available the recording available through our website soon after today. We will be taking questions in addition to those you submitted during your registration. So if a question occurs to you, please do capture it using the Q&A function in the meeting chat today. And there are many WGEA colleagues on the call with us today to make everything work effectively. You'll meet some of them because I'll be presenting shortly. But I do want to shout out to Diana, Lizzie and Tallulah, who are in the background keeping everything running for us today to make it all work seamlessly. So thank you very much. So let's begin. And I would like to begin by handing to our CEO, Mary Wooldridge, who can provide some background and context for the reporting program before we dive into some more of the details. So, Mary, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Penelope, and great to be with everyone today, and thanks for coming along for this webinar. Really, it's just a chance to connect in at this critical time with all this information that's been given and to engage in terms of how to use it, how to maximise its potential, and also where to from here. So I won't go over the, of course, details in terms of reporting. You're all very familiar with it, but of course we do structure our information we provide back to you by our gender equality indicators, which guides our work, and we know that they're the levers that actually help to drive change. And we're very appreciative of the work and the time that it takes to report, and we're always seeking to strive to get better information back to you to help your decision making. And importantly, of course, we've got an amazing data set, and it is a world-leading data set because of the work each of you do to make sure we can report, that you can report to us and that we can aggregate, analyse and present that data more broadly. So we just want to touch on the cycle in terms of reporting because, obviously, there's a set of things that happen, and just to recap, April and May for reporting, plus any extension. And just a reminder, if you are seeking an extension, it has to be done within the time frame, within the April-May time frame. You get your executive summary immediately, and the industry benchmark report comes out in November, and you just have received that recently. We released our scorecard just a couple of weeks ago, and of course the Data Explorer was released at the same time. And what that has meant is that all of your information, excluding the gender pay gap and quartile information, is now published on our website. And please, and you'll get multiple plugs during the course of this webinar, make sure you go to the Data Explorer. It's an amazing resource in terms of the information at a national, industry and employer level. The employer statement is voluntary and is an opportunity to put your context and your information alongside the GPG, because we know that the gender pay gap is just one or a couple of numbers. And so we really encourage you to develop an employer statement. And now that you have both, of course, your executive summary and industry benchmark report, is a good time to be developing them. And there is a requirement to share your executive summary and your industry benchmark report with your governing body. And we also encourage you to submit your employer statement at the same time. And then late February, or may end up creeping over into early March, we will be publishing the next round of employer gender pay gaps on the Data Explorer. So there's a cycle that continues, and then reporting, of course, will continue again next year. So once again, thanks for all the work that you do, and I'm going to hand back to Penelope and the team, or I'm actually handing back to Celeste, who's our Education and Insights Manager, to take you through the reports. Over to you, Celeste.
Thank you, Mary. So I'm going to take you through an overview of the reports that employers can generate and download from our reporting portal. If we move to the next slide, there are 3 key reports that I'll speak to. One is the Executive Summary Report. One is a new corporate group executive summary, which will only go to certain employers as relevant. And one is the Industry Benchmark Report. So if we take a look at the Executive Summary Report on the next slide, this is the first report that employers will have access to after they've finished their reporting process. The executive summary can be generated for any employer that reports with 80 or more employees in the workplace profile. And the executive summary sets out key results from your submission to WGEA's annual gender equality reporting. It lists the results against each of the 6 gender equality indicators, and it is available to employers immediately after you complete the gender equality reporting submission. And your executive summary report can be generated and downloaded in the Data and Insights tab of the WGEA portal under Reports. The next report, which is a new one, is the Corporate Group Executive Summary. This is the first year that we are releasing them, and it will be made available to employers who report in a corporate structure. So for example, where there's a parent company and subsidiary companies who report within that structure. WGEA is required to publish gender pay gaps for all relevant employers, which could be a standalone company or a corporate group or a subsidiary of a corporate group. As many corporate group results are only finalised once all of the reporting has been completed, corporate group CEOs and reporting contacts will shortly be receiving a email to let them know that the corporate group executive summary is available for download. It captures key aggregate workforce data across your whole corporate group. So looking at the gender pay gap across all employees in your corporate group, and also things like workforce composition by gender. And these should be made available to you sometime this week. If we take a look now at the Industry Benchmark Report, this is usually available a few months after reporting closes, typically around November. The purpose of this report is to give an employer the opportunity to compare their results with other organisations in a comparison group. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the comparison groups are made shortly. The report itself presents a snapshot of employer results covering a select number of gender equality indicators, including key results such as gender pay gaps, workforce compositions, and parental leave entitlements. This is a little bit different to your executive summary, which looks at every one of the 6 GEIs. This report is available later than the executive summary because it's dependent on the other employers in your corporate group to finalise their reporting. As such, it usually comes out in November. Finally, it's really important to note that industry benchmark reports are not available for corporate groups because it's difficult to make a sort of meaningful comparison to other corporate groups in our reporting system. I'm now going to hand over to Penelope and Camilla, who will speak to how you can interpret your reports.
Thanks so much, Celeste. So crucially, these reports are really valuable to help you understand the picture of gender equality in your organisation what's driving that, and then crucially, where you might focus your attention to target action to improve workplace gender equality. So these reports can tell you a lot about your own performance in relation to gender equality, in relation to those 6 gender equality indicators that Mary and Celeste both spoke to, as well as how you compare with industry peers. We know that's a key focus area, particularly for boards, but also for other stakeholders looking to assess performance. There's a lot of information in the reports, and we get a lot of queries from employers about how to make sense of it and how to really use it for its full potential. So we understand that people really want to be confident that they're understanding and interpreting their data effectively. They want to feel really well placed to advise their stakeholders on what to make of the reports and how they can use some of those insights to drive improvement. And as per that, that's a workflow Mary spoke to earlier. We know that as part of coming to terms with the information in your reports, often it's about how do you come to terms with that in a way you can then explain to others. So you can brief your leaders and your other stakeholders on what's going on with gender equality, what you're doing well, and where you're seeking to make improvements. So to help us build that confidence in interpreting what we're seeing in the reports, I'm going to hand to Dr. Camilla Stonia, our Senior Education and Research Advisor, to walk you through how to interpret the key data in your reports and target areas for action.
Thanks, Penelope. So in this next section, I'm going to go through a couple of common examples that employers, common queries that employers send to us about how to analyse this data and what it means and how it can drive next steps. I'm going to start off by talking particularly about interpreting drivers of your gender pay gap, which you can find in your executive summary. So the table at the bottom of this slide is a common gender pay gap table you see in exec summary, showing your average total REM, median total REM, average base salary and median base salary gender pay gaps for your organisation. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at those pay quartiles, which is commonly in your executive summary as well. So in this example, we can see this employer has an average total remuneration gender pay gap, 24.5%, of higher than their median total remuneration gender pay gap, sitting at 20.1%. And a similar relationship is seen for the base salary gender pay gaps. So this relationship tells us that an average gender pay gap higher than a median means that highly paid male employees are a key driver of the organisation's gender pay gap. And you can reaffirm this by looking at your pay quartiles. So the quartile graph on the right-hand side there, you'll see in your exec summary, also in your IBR. The total workforce composition is shown in the top bar, and then it shows the 4 pay quartiles and the composition of women and men in each of those. And if you want to know more about how we calculate pay quartiles, you can look at our gender pay gap technical guide for further information. So you can see in this example that there's 52% of men in that total workforce, but 67% of the upper pay quartile are male employees. So they are overrepresented in that highest paying quartile, and that does reaffirm that relationship of average being higher than median, indicating highly paid male employees are a key driver there. So that's a really quick takeaway you can get from just looking at your executive summary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that relationship between average and median on the next slide. So the difference that WGEA publishes average and median gender pay gaps, and the difference in relation really sheds light on drivers of your organisation's gender pay gap. We've got a couple of statistical graphs here, but I'll break them down for you. So that left-hand side shows the example I was just talking about before, the situation where your average is higher than your median. And this is indicating, if we plot all of your employees' salaries on a distribution graph, that there's more employees sitting on the right-hand tail, that right-hand side of the graph, that highly paid employees. And that is indicating the average is going to shift a little bit further to the right-hand side, whereas your median, which is quite a robust statistic and not as impacted as outliers such as highly paid individuals. And so it shows that the average higher than the median is highly paid male employees are a driver. On the opposite side of things, when we look at the right-hand side of the graph, the average is actually less than the median. And this indicates that lower paid female employees are a key driver of your organisation's gender pay gap. So now there's more employees sitting on the left-hand side of the graph, noting that there's a hard floor of the minimum wage, so it doesn't go all the way to zero. So that's just a really quick takeaway you can take from looking at your exec summary and your average and median gender pay gaps on where next steps you should be focusing on. So now I'll talk a little bit about how your gender pay gap this year could have changed quite drastically from last year. And that's because of changes in how WGEA calculates employer gender pay gaps and now it includes remuneration of CEOs and heads of business, which are highly paid employees and typically male employees. So you may notice a large difference between this year's gender pay gap and last year's gender pay gap. You can see this in your exec summary, and I've got an example employer and a table you might see in your exec summary down below, and you can see over time how that might change. So if you can identify if there's a CEO effect, what we call the CEO effect occurring at your organization, if your average gender pay gap has changed, generally increased quite significantly, but your median gender pay gap has remained relatively stable or could be just decreasing as per its previous trend. And that's what this table down the bottom, this example table, is trying to show you. So if you look at the average total remuneration over time, you can see there's between years that there is a decrease, and then this year there's been a big increase in average gender pay gap. And that's because, as I showed in the previous graph, your average is highly impacted by highly paid employees. So that's the CEO effect. But the median total remuneration gender pay gaps in the bottom row we can see is still steadily decreasing. So that is indicating progress is still occurring because the median is not as heavily impacted by outliers. You can further explore this by looking at your overall manager gender pay gaps, which includes CEOs, as well as key management personnel gender pay gaps, and see how they may have changed from previous years to indicate if that CEO effect is having a significant role in your organization. So now I'm going to move on to the industry benchmark reports. And as Celeste said, we'll talk a little bit about how comparison groups are made, because we know this is a common question we get from employers. So your comparison group, which you'll see in the yellow box at the top of your IBR, I've got an example screen grab in the middle of the slide there, is a combination of ANZIC industry class, so the Australian and New Zealand Standard Industrial Classification, ANZIC industry class, and employers of a similar size range. So in this example, the industry name is showing that industry class level. In this case, it's house construction. And underneath that is showing the employee size range. And in this case, it's 250 to 499 employees, but there are 5 different size categories WGEA uses, which is shown on the right-hand side there. So it's important to note that if we create a comparison group for an employer using that industry class and size range, and there are less than 5 employers in that comparison group, we have to bump it up to the industry division to make a more appropriate comparison group for that employer. So that's why your industry might look a little bit different if it's at the class or division level. But it's important to note that in our newly updated Data Explorer, we now allow for that more granular analysis at the group and class level, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly, so you can create further comparison groups as required. We'll also talk now a little bit about how your comparison group gender pay gap, which has actually changed this year. Again, there's been a bit of change in the calculation method. For that reason, when you're looking at your industry benchmark report this year, your comparison group gender pay gap may be quite different. Maybe they're performing better in comparison to previous years, and this is most likely because of this change. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we calculate comparison group gender pay gaps. So it's calculated as the midpoint of employer gender pay gaps in that group. So what this means is that 50% of employers have a gender pay gap higher than this value and 50% lower. We often call it the typical employer as well, the typical employer of your comparison group. So we'll go through a visual example for you to try and break it down. Say you have 7 employers in your comparison group, and you want to know what the comparison group average total remuneration gender pay gap is. What we do is we take the average total remuneration employer gender pay gaps for all of those 7 employers, which we've visualized here for you. We'd order them from smallest to largest, and we'd find that midpoint, that middle value, also known as the median. And in this example, this is the 4th employer there because there's 7 employers, and it's 10.1%. So that's the value, and that's how it's calculated. And so it's important to know that has changed a little bit from previous years. So now I'll move on to talking about some of the questions you can ask yourself when you're looking at your industry benchmark report to help drive next steps and really analyze and interpret that data. So we know that stakeholders are motivated to act when they're made aware of comparing less favorably than their peers. So this is where the industry benchmark really comes into play. So some of the questions you could ask yourself are, how does your gender pay gap compare with others in your comparison group? So again, that typical employer I was just talking about. What are the areas of relative strength and weaknesses? Where are you performing well? Where can you do better? How could you explain key differences between your performance and others to stakeholders, such as your governing body? And what areas might you prioritize for action and next steps? So these are some really great questions you can ask yourself when you're reflecting on your results in your industry benchmark report. Before I hand over to Penelope, I'm going to talk a little bit about the new Data Explorer because it really is a great next steps and to build on your IBR. So there are 3 different Data Explorers when you go to our Data Explorer page, and that's in the top of the slide here. There's a national, industry, and employer level Data Explorer. So we're going to talk a little bit about the industry level Data Explorer first. So when you click that button, you see the screen grab below is what you'll see. There's data presented across all 6 GEIs, and there's a bunch of filters you can use: employee size, industry division, industry subdivision, and we've also highlighted in blue the 2 new filters you can add: industry group and industry class level. So you can recreate creating your comparison group using the class and size filters and look at data across all 6 GEIs. And I'll show you an example on the next slide of that. So for example, using that same house construction company example, you could go in and select the size filter range of 250 to 499 employees. You could find your industry class, which was house construction, and then you can look at how your comparison group performs across all 6 GEIs. Because the IBR is only a select number of GEIs, you can have a look across the performance across all 6 and compare to how you're doing. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the employer level Data Explorer. We know that some employers really have a key competitor in mind that they want to benchmark themselves against. So you can do that with our Employer Data Explorer. So you can go in and select an individual employer and have a look at their performance across, again, all 6 GEIs. And this is what the screen grab on the right of the slide is showing you. We've, again, used that same house construction company. So selected a construction company and looking at their performance, in this case, against GEI 4, parental leave. So you can look at the uptake of parental leave in this company for men and women, and then also all the key policies that they have against this GEI as well. So you can really dig into quite a lot of data for individual employers, noting that the gender pay gaps and that is not public yet. But we encourage you to play around with the new Data Explorer and really look into further comparisons and analysis and build on your IBR. And I'll now hand back to Penelope to talk about driving action and next steps.
Thanks so much, Camilla, that's fantastic. And we know that many employers have found a lot of value. And to speak to one of the questions that's come through already through the session today about, like making those comparisons that your stakeholders find meaningful. So we give you a sense in the benchmark report in relation to others in the same industry of a comparable size to you. And also we know that many organisations have particular competitors that they like to peg themselves against or benchmark themselves against. And so if there are particular companies that you're following, you can go into Data Explorer, see how they're doing relative to your performance, and also, as Camilla was pointing out, dig into what might be driving that. So for example, are their policy settings quite different from yours, in which case you might like to choose that area to focus your actions. So it's a really powerful tool to help you to feel very comfortable with your own performance in relation to gender equality relative to others, and also to pinpoint where you might like to focus to take further action. So in terms of how we then can use these reports to really drive change, it really is about using these reports as a jumping off point for your own analysis and your own action planning. And often a key part of that is about how do you communicate with your executive, with your board, with your key decision makers to help them understand what to take from these reports that can give you confidence in the action plans that you're developing, and also that you're tracking well over time in terms of your improved performance. So things we know can be really useful to help to drive change is to highlight your progress year on year, for example, in relation to gender pay gaps, but also in relation to the other gender equality indicators that are evident in the reports there. So hopefully you can all chart some progress over time, which can really help to build confidence of your stakeholders that when they commit to concerted action, they will see results over time. So that temporal lens is really important. We know that comparisons matter. Employees are very motivated when, by particularly poor comparisons with competitors, that they like to feel that they're doing well. They're very proud of their organisations, rightly, and want to make sure that they measure up positively in relation to others. So we know both from the experience of publishing gender pay gaps in the UK and also early data from the Australian experience is that sort of a comparison can really drive the attention of executives and also the action that drives change. So those key comparisons are really key to helping your stakeholders get on board, and these tools, the reports we're sharing, but also the Data Explorer are really fundamental to enabling that. And of course, the real purpose of all of the information that we're sharing is to help you plan targeted action, and starting with a gender pay gap analysis is a really, really good place to start because it helps you understand what are the dynamics of your workforce that are driving the results that you're seeing. Is it about gender imbalance, in particular pay quartiles? Is it about the workforce composition overall? All these questions these reports shed light on all those key questions that can then help you hone in on where it's most meaningful for your organisation to take targeted action to improve gender equality. So in terms of next steps from here, if I can return again to that sort of cycle that Mary spoke to originally, you've got your executive summaries and industry benchmark reports. You'll soon get the corporate group executive summary where that's relevant. And you'll be absolutely, we hope, and now as we start December, in the thick of really grappling with what those reports are telling you and how you can explain that for your stakeholders, how you can use that to target action. And as Mary said, we encourage employers also to use that to inform that voluntary employer statement that can put your case around how you understand gender equality in your organisation and what you're putting in place to make improvements there. So that's really key. It is a statutory requirement that you share the executive summary and the industry benchmark report with your governing body, and we'll ask you about that in the reporting next year to make sure that that's been ticked off. And of course, the idea is that by putting it in front of those stakeholders, it drives their attention, it drives action. For corporate groups too, they report their corporate group executive summary to their governing body. So we're right in the middle of the data interpretation at the moment. Let me segue now into just foreshadowing a couple of changes to reporting for 2025, because we typically get asked questions about reporting. We know people are keen to prepare early, so let me speak to a couple of points around reporting. We've aimed to simplify where we can, and there are a few small changes to improve and simplify the reporting experience. So in relation to those changes, we've got a new question about who you share your public reports with. As per changes in our legislation. We've tweaked a couple of questions to make them a little bit more clear and hopefully easy for you to respond to. You will be asked to report the number of weeks available for paid parental leave. We've removed the need to specify whether flexible working arrangements are formal or informal, so there's a simplification there. And a further simplification is removing the need to specify whether the supports for employees with caring responsibilities are available at some or all work sites. So that streamlining will benefit employers, we hope, in 2025. We've also removed some questions, voluntary questions in relation to whether you collect diversity data and voluntary questions on the uptake of paid domestic and family violence leave. We've also issued new guidance on which policy and strategy questions are assessed for the gender equality standard, which applies to employers with 500 or more employees. And we've changed the template in the sense of how paid parental leave questions appear in the offline template. And I know that many of you look to those templates as you prepare your data for reporting. I should say too, we're very fortunate to have a member of our reporting team here as well, if there are particular questions people have on that. So thank you, Arthur, for your involvement today. Briefly on the next slide, there are some other changes to the workplace profile, or WPP, and the workforce management statistics. So quite limited, and you can scan the QR code online to go directly to the reporting guide if you're keen to dive more into this. But in terms of that WMS, we'll be asking about promotions from non-manager to manager roles by gender and by contract or employment type. We won't be asking for industry information in the WMS because the industry that's assigned to the employer overall will be assigned to all employees, so that will, again, streamline things for you, hopefully. And similarly, in the workplace profile, we won't be collecting industry information because I can see some thumbs up there, so hopefully that's resonating with some people out there. Again, once the industry is set for the employer level, it'll be assigned to all employees. So thank you for your questions there. Finally, in relation to key dates, let me just touch on those. Again, people like to be clear on these dates to help them with their planning, particularly as we head into the summer break, so you can plan your work for next year. The templates will be available in February 2025 for that year's reporting, which will include those Excel files, the WMS, WPP, and also the questionnaire. In late February, you'll see the employer level gender pay gaps released publicly. So that Data Explorer tool that Camilla and Mary spoke to, that will be, again, a focus of national attention. We hope it was obviously a really strong focus nationally in this year, our first year of publishing, and we hope to have that sustained attention in the year ahead as well. And the reporting period for WGEA for 2024-5 will be April the 1st to May the 31st next year. So those are some key dates for you to factor into your planning. And we have time now to segue into some of your questions. And thank you, Lizzie, who's been posting some links in the Q&A as well to some of the resources that I've mentioned. So please feel free to continue adding your questions here if you would like to. Let me pick up a couple of questions that have come in since we started the session. We did have one which I hope that which came in before Camilla spoke, but I think that Camilla's presentation hopefully addressed this one about how do we work out what the comparison groups are in the industry benchmark report. And just to reiterate what Camilla was sharing on her as part of her presentation, it's a combination of the industry that you specify in your reporting and also the size, your employer size relative to others. So you'll be with peers in that sense. But again, if there are particular employers or particular comparisons you're seeking to make, we do encourage you to go to Data Explorer. If you looked at it last year, and over the last year and found it useful, it's 10 times more useful now to enable those really granular comparisons. So if you haven't been there for a while, it's definitely worth a revisit. Just scrolling through other questions people have had. Maybe this one is for you, Camilla. I think it relates to your part of your presentation from Bridget. Can you explain how the median and the midpoint differ, or is it the same thing, which I think may be related to that slide you shared on the industry benchmark report and that midpoint of gender pay gaps. Can you reprise your explanation, Camilla?
Yes, no, in short, it is the same thing. We often just use midpoint because if we're talking about median gender pay gaps, if we were saying the median of a median, that's a bit of a mouthful. So we often use midpoint instead of median to not get you too confused. But you are correct that they are the same thing.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Camilla.
can I jump in there, Penelope? Because I actually think we do use them in a slightly different way in this context that might be worth people understanding. Because we're doing a midpoint of employer gender pay gaps, and so that looks at all the employers and finds the 50% above and 50% below. When we talk about median, and this is why we do use a distinction in the language, it often relates to the count of all the employees within that group. So it might be all the employees within an employer or all the employees within an industry. So we do use a distinction of the language to midpoint relating to employers and the comparison of the gender pay gaps, and the median relating to employees in that group. So they're technically the same, but we use a distinction in the language to show a distinction in the way that they're the data that sits behind it.
Thank you. And I'm glad someone did raise that question about medians, because we get questions all the time. And I think it is worth flagging that because understanding that data around what are we actually looking at here, the average or the mean versus the median, can unlock a lot of insight. And I think both Celeste and Camilla spoke to this, so it is worth grappling with, and hopefully today has been helpful in that context as well. In terms of other questions, in case you missed it in the chat too, Cara was asking about recordings and slides for today. So we are recording today, and that will go up on our website with other recordings from previous webinars. And also we'll publish the slides too, which might take a little bit longer to arrive because they need to be treated for accessibility. So, but yes, they will be there. So thanks for your question on that. Just scanning through other questions that we have, and I think that we are actually up to date, which is good. And thank you, Liz, for flagging that link to the reporting guide as well, which people can look at now to get ready for next year. Just invite people to flag any questions that I might have missed.
I have a quick one to add on, Penelope. Hi, everyone. My name is Arthur. I'm the reporting manager here at the agency. Just looking at the question regarding benchmark comparisons, if you're looking for the specific list of employers within that benchmark group, if that's not something you can find on the Data Explorer, I'll just let you know that you can send us in a case to support@wgea.gov.au. That's something our data team can provide for you. So if you are looking for the specific names of who is in a specific comparison group, and you can't find that on the Explorer, just feel free to send us an email.
Thanks, Arthur. And I can expand a little bit on that one as well in terms of in the Data Explorer under the employers comparison, you can go to industry division and get all the employers in the division. And because this is a regular question we get, I think we'll take it on board that it might be useful to be able to search by class and get the list of employers in a class as well as the list of employers in a division. So if your industry benchmark report is compared at a division level, you'll be able to see the companies by looking at the Data Explorer and asking them to sort by industry division. The class, you will need to drop an email, as Arthur said, to the team, but we'll take that on board for further improvement in the future.
Thank you. Mary, while we have you, can I put another question to you that's come through in the chat? We had some voluntary questions in around diversity data and family and domestic violence leave, and we've removed those, which I shared in the questionnaire update. Can you speak to the rationale there for people's benefit?
Yeah, so we've got some information in relation to that, and I've got to say the response rate was relatively low for both aspects of that data. The diversity policy questions still remain, but the data questions don't, and as we've said, the family and domestic violence leave. So it really was a mechanism to get some input and to get a calibration in relation to both numbers who reported, but also those results. And there's now significant work going on in relation to the capacity in a more formal sense to require the collection of that data. And until such time as we have amendments to our instruments that would enable us to do that, we won't be collecting the voluntary information.
Thanks, Mary. Since you're on a roll, can I throw another question to you about employer of choice, for gender equality citation? So I'm just scrolling down to find the question again because it's disappeared. Will there still be a WGEA employer of choice citation, which people understand has been under review? And it's very topical at the moment, Mary, so perhaps you'd like to speak to that.
I've been working on that just in the last couple of hours as well. So we are working hard. Our citation is absolutely continuing. We are working to try and have the new criteria up before the end of the year. But we do a review of the citation every 5 years. And so this has been the review process. So as I say, we're reorienting some of the criteria and the standards in relation to the citation to be very outcome focused. We've got a lot more information. We've got gender pay gap publishing now, of course, as well. And so there will be the ability to apply later next year, but the criteria will be up, all going well before the end of the year. So you've got time to work towards that. And we certainly encourage everyone who would like to consider it to have a look at the employer of choice for gender equality citation and consider using that structure and process to go through to improve what's happening for gender equality in your workplace.
Great, thank you, Mary. Thanks for your interest in that from the questioner as well. We have a question from Benjamin on the date that employers can add a link to their employer statement into the portal, which appears on Data Explorer. That may be a question for you too, Mary.
So what we're working towards, and you will be notified, but that February will be the time frame where you can upload your link. And before we publish, and we're looking at publishing late Feb or early March. So upload your link in February, and there'll be further information in relation to that availability.
Thank you. I think last time we experienced a bit of a flurry, so we're interested to see to what extent that's repeated this year, because many employers found it really, really useful as a way of reflecting on their progress. And I know that many employers have also been looking at the ones published by their competitors or peer organisations that are online as a way just to help them understand what others who they're keeping an eye on are doing in relation to workplace gender equality. So it's a great resource for you, as well as a way for you to communicate what you're doing more publicly as well.
And we do require them a little bit in advance of when we publish the gender pay gap so that we can process that. So there will be a deadline before the end of Feb, to which we encourage employers to meet, so that we've got time to work them through our system and get them published to coincide with the publishing of the gender pay gaps.
And just to add on to that, Mary, for those employers who run out of time and don't make that deadline, you can still provide an employer statement, but it may be a delay of a couple of days to a week before it may appear in our Data Explorer. So it's perfectly fine to provide a statement after the deadline date that we'll advise you of, just noting that there will be a delay.
Thank you, Arthur. Well, Arthur, while we have you, and thank you, Arthur, one of the stars of our reporting team is here. Can I put this question to you about the corporate group? So, and the question is, if a relevant employer has employees, in brackets 850, is less than the corporate group, 4,500, does that impact your comparison group for the industry benchmark report?
It's a good question. So previously, employers were receiving these reports at quite a broad level. A lot of employers thrown into a bucket, whereas now we're getting quite specific to the entity level. So the specific ABN where the employees work. So for that company within a larger group of 850, it will be benchmarked specifically against employers that are around the 850 mark for that ABN specific primary activity, so their industry class. This is about making sure this information that we're providing you and the benchmarking is more relevant but more specific as well. It's for the reason why we're not doing benchmarking at group level, because there's so many different industries, so many different types of companies, that makes it very difficult and quite unique to compare against another.
Thank you so much, Arthur. I might speak to this next question and then give you the chance as well, Mary, to add your perspective. The question is, how does your system cater to the scenario where completion of tasks or roles in the organisation is influenced by the customer's choice of the gender of their assigned worker and not you as the organisation? And also where pay is determined by an enterprise agreement that's gender neutral, and who will we discuss this with? So Julie, let me have a go at that. I think this is a great example, great question, because we know that these workforce dynamics are really pertinent to many organisations. And again, the employer statement's a great opportunity for you to put your case in relation to these nuances. So let me give you an example of, so there are organisations we know, for example, in social service delivery, where, for argument's sake, most of the clients are women, and in family and domestic violence, for example, and they would like to have care or services delivered by a woman rather than a man, and so there can be an imbalance in that frontline workforce of women, and that's something that the organisation might say, we're pretty comfortable with that. In relation to the service delivery needs, I know that one organisation that's delving deeply into just this question has decided we do need to have some proportionality in our workforce that reflects our customer base by gender and by other characteristics as well. So their gender equality targets and aspirations are really clearly informed by their data and also appropriate to the context of the industry that they're working in. So if you find yourself in a context where gender is relevant to service delivery and you've thought about that quite hard and you're working on gender equality in different ways and are pretty comfortable with your mix of service delivery frontline people, then that's something you can put in your employer statement. In terms of where cases are, where pay is determined by an enterprise agreement, we know that's obviously very relevant to many employers, and again, something you can put in your employer statement. So you might have other gender equality priorities in terms of workforce composition, for example, and not so much focused on remuneration, where you have less influence over some of the remuneration settings because of the enterprise agreement. But Mary, why don't I give you the opportunity to comment on either or both of those points?
And as we know, certainly on the second, lots of people have their compensation set for their workforce or much of their workforce under EAs or different awards. But what we know, of course, about gender pay gaps is it's a combination of pay and composition. So if pay is relatively set, then the lever you have is more around what you do on composition. As well, though, we do see that things like bonus structures and overtime and those sorts of things can be a big influence in terms of the outcomes of the gender pay gap. So, you'll have less flexibility about one aspect, but still plenty of flexibility about other aspects and other levers where you can focus time and effort. You can look at the, gendered outcomes in terms of uptake of overtime. And if there's ways to manage that or change the dynamic, you can look at your composition. So even in some industries that are highly feminized with, very set pay rates, we have gender pay gaps in favour of men because in the senior management roles, there's a lot of men in those positions relative to women and relative to a broad workforce, which is highly feminized. So employer statement's a great place to describe it, and there's still plenty of levers and things to work on if you have less flexibility on pay.
Thank you very much. Just looking through, so I think Chloe's posted a question about the New Year's templates to be updated. I think Mary might have responded to that, saying it's looking at February. And thanks, Julie, for your comment. And Carol, your question on, please, more clarity, please, on the calculation methods and the impact on the data. The good news is that Camilla, who's on the line, has just been is the author of the Gender Pay Gap Technical Guide, which is on our website and will be updated any moment now. So I think Lizzie's going to post a link to that in the chat as well for people's benefit. And that really, actually, Camilla, do you want to speak to some of the questions that resource addresses?
Yeah, that goes into detail about what employees are included or excluded, and how it might change how it's changed year on year, as well as how we create the quartiles for that pay quartile analysis and goes through some scenarios. So it really goes into quite a lot of detail for you to understand how we create that data. But as Penelope said, it's currently being updated. So it is last year's version, but the new one is forthcoming.
Thank you. This might be a question for you, Arthur, from Dave. And Dave says that the standard role descriptions that WGEA uses don't relate to his organisation, but of course he understands the need for standardised descriptions, but looking for guidance on the hierarchy of role descriptions that WGEA uses. So he says, for example, we recently understood that key management personnel may be more senior than the category other executives, and they had thought the reverse was true. And because if there's confusion about that it might result in inappropriate reporting of leadership gender mix. So can you provide guidance, Arthur, on that hierarchy of who outranks whom in terms of key management personnel, other executives, or how you'd like people to think about that so they can make sure that they can really appropriately map on their structures to our role hierarchy?
It's a really great question. Thank you for that. So with our manager categories, of course, they are very generic and very standardised for the purpose that they must work for every employer in every industry across Australia. But in saying that, they are, generally speaking, in a rough seniority order from other managers up to KMP, CEO and HOB are usually your leadership categories at the top. Now, if in the past you've categorised someone one way or the other and changed that in the future, as long as you believe that you're accurately categorising your managers, that is the primary reason to use a particular manager category. So we don't map basically everyone who is this must be this type of manager category. What we can do, we'll share a link in this chat of where you can find the descriptions of the manager categories as they do sort of run into their types of roles and responsibilities. That's the key feature of determining which one to use. That being said, generally speaking, KMPs are usually your highest managers before you reach CEO or HOB, so a subsidiary CEO level. But it is completely up to you over which ones you use. Our advice is that you use the ones which are most relevant to the actual roles and responsibilities. The reason why I mention this is that in some larger groups, they will have a very defined KMP level, head of finance, head of this, head of that. Whereas in smaller entities, their head of finance might actually map more to a senior manager rather than a KMP. So really it is down to reading the descriptions and then determining which is the sort of best fit for your managers. And if you have moments where could go one way or the other, and you do need just a little bit of guidance, you can obviously get in touch with us, send us an email. But we do try not to say this equals that, as it is down to you as the employer to determine those, but we're certainly happy to help and to answer any questions.
Thank you, Arthur. While I have you, Arthur, can I put to you another question that's been popular in the chat? If you are a corporate group, and if any of your subsidiaries have fewer than 80 employees under their own ABM, will a corporate group executive summary be produced, or do the subsidiaries need more than 80 employees to be included in that group report?
It's an excellent question. So your corporate group executive summary is every employee you've reported from every entity across your group, no matter the size. So it will include employees who are reported. Let's just say you have a couple of stores which are their own ABNs and they have 4 or 5 employees each. Obviously, those individual entities will not receive their own executive summary or benchmark report just because there's too few employees to accurately make that comparison or make that calculation, but they will form part of the corporate group executive summary. So you're broad, everyone in one big bucket. So they will be part of that report, yes.
Thank you. And thank you, Liz, for posting the support email address in the Q&A there as well. As Arthur said, if you've still got further questions, then please do get in touch and we'll help you to work through those. Did you want to come in there, Mary? I just saw your screen flash up. Maybe a further question for you on reporting, Arthur, in relation to how to treat certain staff movements. So someone's asked, if there were 2 CTOs, which we take to be Chief Technology Officers, who left and were hired during the reporting period, is it normal to include them both in the data?
The answer, so I'll divide up my answer. So if it's about their actual movements, which is recorded in the Workforce Management Statistics Excel sheet, yep, you would record the CTOs. If they voluntarily resigned, they'd be recorded in that question. And if they were reappointed to a role, they'd appear in that question. That's because that Excel sheet about the movements is about the 12-month period. Who was hired, who resigned, who went on parental leave within that 12-month period. I think your question's actually about the workplace profile, which is, where you're providing salary and remuneration information. The answer is it all comes down to your snapshot date. So the first thing I advise anyone who is a first-time reporter is to just take a pause 5 minutes and read the explanation tab, just because it mentions this thing called a snapshot date. I sometimes have employers who say, I have so many employees who come and go throughout the 12-month period. That's too many people to report on their salary and remuneration information. My answer is you're making it much more harder than it actually needs to be. We already know it's very difficult, but you don't need to make it harder. The snapshot date, think of it like a census. It's one day in the 12-month period. Majority of employers use the last possible date, which is the 31st of March. And essentially, you report in that file anyone employed as at that specific date. So to use your example, if your CTO throughout that 12-month period, if they resigned and then came back, if they were an employee as at your snapshot date, they would be reported on. But let's just say they left, your snapshot date and then they came back afterwards, you wouldn't be reporting on them because they weren't an employee as at that specific date. If you have any questions about this, obviously, please feel free to get in touch. My team's quite responsive, especially at this time of the year. But yeah, the short answer is you would only report them if they were employed as at your snapshot date in the workplace profile.
Thank you, Arthur. And I think I've got another one for you, Arthur, if you can manage it. It's about the definition of manager. So does the definition of manager for our purposes require people to be managing other people, or can they be managers of functions or specialists with no direct reports?
See, I had my first mute. It's a very good question. The first thing we say is that a supervisor is not a manager. In and of itself, someone supervising staff doesn't mean that they're a manager. Without sort of getting into the weeds and the specifics, because one person's manager in one company is another person's non-manager in another, would be to have a check of those manager categories. The lowest manager category is generally other managers. If that description maps on to the role and responsibility of the employees that you are not sure are managers or not, that would be the way to go. However, again, if you're not sure, send us an email. We're very happy to help.